Sarah Martinez stepped off the Greyhound bus in the small town of Millbrook, Texas, with nothing but a worn duffel bag slung over her shoulder and $23 in her pocket. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of the bus station, and she could feel the stares of locals burning into her back as she walked toward the main street. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, with her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing faded jeans and a plain white t-shirt, she looked like just another young woman down on her luck. What the people of Millbrook didn't know was that Sarah had just completed 8 years of active duty in the Army's most elite Special Operations Unit. She had been deployed to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, had led missions behind enemy lines, and had received commendations that most soldiers could only dream of. But none of that mattered now. She was home, trying to figure out how to live a normal life after everything she had seen and done. The town of Millbrook hadn't changed much since Sarah left for basic training at 18. The same weathered storefronts lined Main Street, the same pickup trucks were parked outside Murphy's Diner, and the same group of men still gathered on the bench outside the hardware store every afternoon to gossip and judge anyone who walked by. Sarah recognized several faces from her youth, though none of them seemed to recognize her. She had been just another quiet kid from the wrong side of town when she left, and, apparently, that's all they saw when they looked at her now. Sarah found a small apartment above the old pharmacy for $300 a month. The landlord, an elderly man named Frank Peterson, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism when she inquired about the place. "You got a job lined up?" he asked, his weathered hands resting on his belt buckle. "Because I don't rent to deadbeats or troublemakers." "I'll find work," Sarah replied quietly, counting out the cash for the first month's rent and deposit. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words, especially with people who had already made up their minds about who they thought she was. The apartment was small and sparse, with a leaky faucet and windows that didn't quite close properly, but it was clean and private. Sarah set her duffel bag on the narrow bed and looked around at what would be her new home. After years of sleeping in tents, barracks, and sometimes just on the hard ground in hostile territory, the little apartment felt like a palace. She unpacked her few belongings methodically: a couple changes of clothes, some basic toiletries, a few books, and a small wooden box that contained her military decorations and photographs from her time overseas. Within a week, Sarah had found a job at Thompson's auto repair shop on the edge of town. The owner, Bill Thompson, was surprised when the petite young woman walked in asking about work, but he was short-handed and desperate for help. "You know anything about cars?" he asked, wiping his greasy hands on his coveralls. "I can learn," Sarah said simply. What she didn't mention was that she had been trained to maintain and repair military vehicles under combat conditions, could disassemble and rebuild engines blindfolded, and had kept countless Humvees and armored trucks running in the desert heat of Afghanistan. She just needed a chance to prove herself. Bill started her off sweeping floors and organizing parts, paying her minimum wage and making it clear that he was doing her a favor. Sarah worked quietly and efficiently, arriving early and staying late without complaint. She observed everything, learning the layout of the shop and the personalities of the other mechanics. There were 3 full-time guys: Mike, a heavy-set man in his 40s who seemed to think every problem could be solved with a bigger hammer; Johnny, a young hotshot fresh out of trade school who talked more than he worked; and Carlos, a quiet, skilled mechanic who had been with Thompson for over 15 years. It didn't take long for the teasing to start. Mike was the worst, constantly making comments about how a little girl like Sarah didn't belong in a garage. "Why don't you go get a job at the beauty salon?" he would say, loud enough for the customers to hear. "This is man's work, sweetheart." Johnny would laugh and pile on, making jokes about Sarah's size and suggesting she wasn't strong enough to handle the heavy parts or tools. Sarah endured it all without reaction, focusing on her work and learning everything she could. She had faced much worse than workplace bullying during her military career. She had been the only woman in her special ops unit for most of her service, and she had earned the respect of some of the toughest soldiers in the world through her actions, not her words. She could handle a couple of small-town mechanics who felt threatened by her presence. The harassment extended beyond the garage. At Murphy's Diner, where Sarah occasionally grabbed lunch, she would hear whispered comments about the new girl who thought she could do a man's job. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Dolores, was particularly nasty, making Sarah wait longer for service and accidentally spilling coffee near her table. At the grocery store, people would stare and whisper, making assumptions about her background and her reasons for being in town. "Go home, sweetheart," became the common refrain whenever Sarah encountered difficulty or resistance. When she asked for directions, when she tried to make conversation, when she applied for a library card, there was always someone ready to suggest that she didn't belong and should move on to somewhere else. The message was clear: Millbrook was not a place for outsiders, especially not young women without family connections or obvious means of support. Sarah's days fell into a routine. She would wake before dawn, go for a run through the quiet streets of Millbrook, shower, and head to the garage. She kept herself in excellent physical condition, though she was careful not to draw attention to her fitness routine. Her runs took her through different neighborhoods, and she made mental notes of the town's layout, its patterns and rhythms. Old habits died hard, and situational awareness had been drilled into her for so many years that it was now second nature. At the garage, she continued to work quietly while absorbing everything around her. She noticed that Carlos was having trouble with a transmission rebuild on a 2015 Ford F-150, struggling with a problem that had been plaguing him for days. Bill was getting frustrated with the delay, and the customer was calling daily for updates. Sarah could see exactly what was wrong and how to fix it, but she knew that offering unsolicited advice would only make things worse for herself. Instead, she waited for an opportunity. When Carlos took a lunch break, leaving his toolbox open and the transmission partially disassembled, Sarah quietly made a small adjustment to the valve body assembly, realigning a component that had been installed incorrectly. It was a subtle fix that would look like Carlos had figured it out himself when he returned. Sure enough, when Carlos came back from lunch and continued working, the transmission suddenly fell into place perfectly. He scratched his head in confusion, not sure what had changed, but grateful that the problem was resolved. Bill was pleased, the customer was happy, and Carlos received credit for solving a difficult problem. This became Sarah's pattern. She would observe, learn, and occasionally make subtle improvements when no one was looking. She helped prevent several costly mistakes and quietly resolved issues that might have taken hours or days to figure out. She never took credit, never drew attention to her contributions, but slowly the garage's efficiency improved and their reputation for quality work grew. Meanwhile, the social isolation continued. Sarah spent her evenings alone in her small apartment, reading books borrowed from the library or working out using bodyweight exercises she had learned in the military. She avoided the local bars and social gatherings, knowing that her presence would only invite more comments and confrontation. She maintained contact with a few former teammates through encrypted messaging apps, but those conversations only emphasized how different her new life was from everything she had known. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival in Millbrook, Sarah was walking home from the grocery store when she heard shouting from behind Murphy's Diner. She paused, listening to the sounds of what was clearly an escalating confrontation. Every instinct told her to investigate, but she forced herself to keep walking. This wasn't her fight, and getting involved would only bring unwanted attention. But, as she continued down the street, she heard a woman's voice calling for help, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Sarah stopped, closed her eyes, and made a decision that would change everything. She set down her grocery bags and walked quickly toward the sound of the disturbance. Behind the diner, she found 3 men surrounding a young woman who couldn't have been more than 19. The girl was backed against a dumpster, clutching a purse while the men demanded money and made increasingly threatening comments. One of them had a broken bottle in his hand, while another was reaching for the girl's purse. "Hey," Sarah called out, her voice calm but commanding. "Leave her alone." The 3 men turned toward Sarah with expressions of amusement and disbelief. They were all significantly larger than her, and they clearly didn't view her as any kind of threat. The one with the bottle laughed. "Look what we got here, boys. Another little sweetheart who wants to play hero. Why don't you go home, sweetheart, before you get hurt?" Sarah assessed the situation quickly. 3 attackers, one armed with an improvised weapon, one victim to protect, limited space to maneuver, and no backup available. She had faced much worse odds in Afghanistan, but never while trying to maintain her cover as an ordinary civilian. "I'm only going to ask once more," Sarah said, stepping closer. "Let the girl go and walk away." The men exchanged looks and burst out laughing. "Or what?" asked the one with the bottle. You gonna call your daddy to come help you? What happened next took less than 15 seconds, but it would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. Sarah moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural to the three men who had been so confident just moments before. She disarmed the man with the bottle using a technique that left him flat on his back with his arm twisted at an angle that made him scream. The second attacker swung at her with a wild haymaker that she ducked under easily before driving her elbow into his solar plexus, dropping him to his knees gasping for breath. The third man tried to run but found himself face down on the asphalt with Sarah's knee in his back and his arm locked in a submission hold that threatened to dislocate his shoulder if he moved. The entire confrontation was over before the young woman being threatened had time to process what she was seeing. Sarah stood up slowly, brushing dirt off her jeans while the three attackers groaned and tried to collect themselves from the ground. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked the girl, who nodded mutely, still clutching her purse and staring in shock at the scene before her. "Call the police," Sarah instructed calmly. "Tell them there was an attempted robbery behind Murphy's Diner. These three will wait right here until the officers arrive." The three men, still struggling to breathe normally and nursing various injuries, seemed inclined to disagree with Sarah's assessment of their immediate plans. The one who had held the bottle started to get back to his feet with obvious intent to leave the scene. "I wouldn't," Sarah said quietly, and something in her voice made all three men freeze. There was an authority there that transcended her small stature and civilian clothes, a tone that spoke of experience with violence and the capacity to inflict much more damage than she had already demonstrated. Within minutes, the area behind Murphy's Diner was swarming with people. The police arrived first, followed by curious onlookers who had heard about the commotion. Word traveled fast in a small town, and soon there was a crowd gathered to see what had happened. Sheriff Jim Bradley was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had seen his share of bar fights and domestic disturbances, but he had never encountered anything quite like this. Three grown men, all with minor but painful injuries, claiming they had been attacked by the small, quiet woman who worked at Thompson's garage. The young woman they had been threatening corroborated Sarah's version of events, describing how Sarah had intervened to stop what was clearly heading toward a serious assault. As Sheriff Bradley took statements and tried to piece together exactly what had occurred, more people arrived on the scene. Bill Thompson pushed through the crowd when he heard that his newest employee was involved in some kind of incident. Mike and Johnny from the garage arrived soon after, curious to see what trouble the little girl had gotten herself into. What they saw challenged everything they thought they knew about Sarah Martinez. The news of the incident spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone in town had heard some version of what happened behind Murphy's Diner, though the details became more exaggerated with each telling. Some said Sarah had fought off 5 men. Others claimed she had used some kind of martial arts weapons. A few people insisted it was all a misunderstanding and that the 3 men were just trying to help the young woman with directions. Sarah arrived at Thompson's garage the next morning to find the atmosphere completely different. Mike and Johnny, who had been at the scene the night before, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and newfound wariness. Carlos nodded respectfully when she walked in, having heard the story from multiple sources overnight. Bill Thompson was clearly unsure how to handle the situation. So, Bill said, approaching Sarah as she hung up her jacket and prepared to start work. "Heard you had quite an evening yesterday." "3 men were bothering a young woman," Sarah replied simply. "I helped her out." "That's not exactly how I heard it," Bill said, studying her face for any sign of the person who had supposedly taken down 3 attackers single-handedly. "People are saying you put them down like some kind of professional fighter." Sarah shrugged and picked up a wrench from the workbench. "People say a lot of things in small towns. Is there something specific you need me to work on today?" Bill wasn't ready to let the subject drop. The story he had heard from multiple witnesses didn't match anything he knew about the quiet young woman he had hired to sweep floors and organize parts. "Look, Sarah, I need to know what I'm dealing with here. If you've got some kind of background in fighting or martial arts or whatever, I need to know about it. This is a business, and I can't have my employees getting into fights with customers." "I defended someone who was being attacked," Sarah said calmly. "I wouldn't call that getting into a fight. And those men weren't customers." Before Bill could respond, Sheriff Bradley walked into the garage. He had spent most of the night thinking about what he had witnessed, and he had some questions that needed answers. "Morning, Bill," the sheriff said, nodding to the garage owner before turning his attention to Sarah. "Miss Martinez, I wonder if I could have a word with you privately." Sarah looked up from the engine she had been examining. "Of course, Sheriff. Is there a problem?" "No problem," Bradley said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just some follow-up questions about last night." They walked outside, away from the curious ears of the other mechanics. Sheriff Bradley had been a cop long enough to recognize when something didn't add up, and everything about Sarah Martinez's story from the previous evening raised red flags. "The three men you encountered last night," Bradley began, pulling out a small notebook. "Tommy Briggs, Kevin Walsh, and Danny Morrison." "You know any of them?" "No," Sarah replied truthfully. "I'd never seen them before." "Well, they're not exactly small guys. Tommy's about 6'2", weighs maybe 220. Kevin's even bigger. And, according to multiple witnesses, you put all three of them down in a matter of seconds." Bradley studied Sarah's face carefully. "Now, I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've seen plenty of bar fights and street scuffles. What you did last night wasn't lucky punches or beginner's luck. That was professional-level combat training." Sarah remained silent, letting the sheriff continue. "So my question is," Bradley said, "what exactly is your background? Because someone with your skills doesn't just show up in a town like Millbrook looking for work at an auto repair shop." "I served in the Army," Sarah said quietly. "I learned some self-defense techniques during my time in service." "What kind of self-defense techniques?" Bradley pressed. "And what was your job in the Army?" Sarah had been dreading this conversation since the moment she decided to intervene the night before. She had known that using her skills would raise questions, but she couldn't have stood by and watched an innocent person be hurt. "I was military police," she said, sticking to the cover story she had prepared. "We received training in hand-to-hand combat and subduing suspects." Bradley nodded slowly, but his expression remained skeptical. "Military police, huh? What base were you stationed at?" "Fort Hood, mostly," Sarah replied. "And I did a couple of deployments overseas." "Fort Hood's a big place," Bradley said. "What unit were you with?" Sarah rattled off the designation of a real military police unit that had been stationed at Fort Hood during her time in service. It was a safe answer because it was verifiable if Bradley decided to check, but it wouldn't reveal anything about her actual role in special operations. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a black SUV with government plates. Two men in dark suits got out and walked directly toward Sarah and Sheriff Bradley. Sarah's blood went cold as she recognized the type of vehicle and the bearing of the men approaching. They had the unmistakable look of federal agents. "Miss Martinez," the taller of the two men said, showing a badge and identification. "I'm Agent David Chen with the Department of Defense. This is Agent Rodriguez. We need to speak with you immediately." Sheriff Bradley looked confused and slightly annoyed. "Now wait just a minute. This woman is a witness in a local incident. What's the DOD's interest in this?" Agent Chen ignored the sheriff and focused entirely on Sarah. "There's been a security breach, Sergeant Martinez. Someone leaked information about your presence here to unauthorized parties. We need to relocate you immediately." Sarah felt her carefully constructed new life crumbling around her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Ma'am, with respect, we don't have time for games," Agent Rodriguez said, glancing around nervously. "Your cover has been blown. There are hostile forces en route to this location, and we need to extract you before they arrive." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. "I'm going to need someone to explain to me what the hell is going on here. Who are you people, and what do you want with Sarah?" Agent Chen sighed and looked at Sarah. "How much does he know?" "Nothing," Sarah replied. "He thinks I was military police." "Well, that's about to change," Chen said. He turned to Sheriff Bradley. "Sheriff, what I'm about to tell you is classified information. Miss Martinez here isn't just a former soldier. She's one of the most decorated special operations soldiers in the history of the U.S. military. Her real name is Staff Sergeant Sarah Elena Martinez, and she was part of a classified unit that conducted some of the most dangerous and sensitive missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Bradley stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. Special operations? She's received the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with V device for valor, and a Purple Heart, Chen continued. She has been personally credited with saving over 30 American lives during her 8 years of active duty. The incident last night with those 3 men? That was probably the least impressive thing she's done in the past decade. The sheriff was struggling to process this information. The quiet young woman who had been working at the local garage was apparently some kind of elite warrior with a classified military background. But why is she here? Bradley asked. And why is the DoD involved? Sergeant Martinez was supposed to be in a witness protection program, Agent Rodriguez explained. She testified against some very dangerous people during her last deployment. People who have been trying to find her ever since. Yesterday's incident created too much attention, and now her location has been compromised. Sarah finally spoke up. How bad is it? Bad, Chen replied grimly. The Kozlov brothers have dispatched a 6-man team. They should arrive in Millbrook within the next 12 hours. We need to move you now. Sheriff Bradley held up his hand. Whoa, wait. The Kozlov brothers? As in the Russian arms dealers who've been in the news? The same ones, Rodriguez confirmed. Sergeant Martinez's testimony put their operation in Afghanistan out of business and landed several of their associates in federal prison. They've been hunting her ever since. Sarah felt a familiar weight settling on her shoulders. Just when she had thought she could have a normal life, her past was catching up with her again. What's the plan? Safe house in Colorado until we can arrange something more permanent, Chen said. New identity, new location, complete reset. No, Sarah said firmly. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of hiding. I came here to try to build a life, and I'm not going to let them chase me away. Agent Rodriguez looked incredulous. Ma'am, these are serious people. They've already killed 2 federal witnesses who testified against them. You can't take them on by yourself. She won't be by herself, a voice said from behind them. They turned to see Carlos walking toward them, followed by Bill Thompson and, surprisingly, Mike and Johnny from the garage. Carlos, what are you doing? Sarah asked. I heard enough to know that you're in trouble, Carlos replied. And I know that you've been helping out around the garage more than anyone realizes. I've been watching, Sarah. I know you've been fixing problems and preventing mistakes without taking credit. You've got skills that go way beyond changing oil. Bill Thompson stepped forward. Look, I don't pretend to understand all this military stuff, but Sarah's been working for me for a month now. She's shown up every day, worked hard, never complained, and apparently saved that girl's life last night. Far as I'm concerned, she's earned the right to make her own decisions about whether to stay or go. Even Mike, who had been the most hostile towards Sarah since her arrival, spoke up. I may have given you a hard time, but what you did last night took real guts. If these Russian guys are coming here looking for you, they're going to have to go through all of us first. Agent Chen looked around at the group of mechanics and the small-town sheriff who were volunteering to take on a team of international assassins. This is not a movie, people. These are trained killers with military-grade equipment. You'll all be dead within the first 5 minutes. Sarah was touched by the unexpected support from people who had barely tolerated her presence just days before, but she knew the agents were right about the danger. They're right, she said. These aren't local criminals or drunk cowboys. They're professionals, and they won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way. So what do you suggest? Sheriff Bradley asked. We just let them waltz into our town and take you? I don't think so. This is my jurisdiction, and I'm not about to let foreign killers operate here without a fight. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her. These people barely knew her, but they were willing to risk their lives to protect her. It was more loyalty than she had received from some of her former military colleagues. If I stay, Sarah said slowly, it won't just be about protecting me. Once they realize I'm not coming quietly, they'll start hurting innocent people to draw me out. That's how these people operate. Then, we evacuate the town, Bradley said simply. Send everyone who doesn't need to be here to stay with relatives in other counties. Anyone who stays does so voluntarily, knowing the risks. Agent Rodriguez shook his head. You're talking about turning a civilian population center into a battleground. The collateral damage could be enormous. The collateral damage will be worse if we let them operate unchallenged, Sarah countered. At least this way, we control the battlefield and the timing. Agent Chan realized that Sarah had already made her decision. If you're determined to make a stand here, we can provide some support. I can get a tactical team here within 6 hours. No, Sarah said firmly. The moment federal tactical teams show up, this becomes an international incident. The Kozlovs will disappear, regroup, and come back later when I'm not expecting them. It's better to end this now, on my terms. Bradley nodded approvingly. What do you need from us? Sarah looked around the group, mentally cataloging their skills and limitations. First, we need to evacuate all non-essential personnel from the town center. Anyone with children, elderly family members, or no combat experience needs to be gone by tonight. I can handle that, Bradley said. What else? We need to turn this place into a fortress, Sarah said, her mind already working through defensive strategies. Barricades, choke points, overlapping fields of fire. We need to force them to come at us in a way that negates their numerical advantage. Carlos stepped forward. The garage has plenty of welding equipment and scrap metal. We can build barriers and fortifications. Good, Sarah said. We'll also need weapons. I'm assuming you have a gun safe at the sheriff's office? Full arsenal, Bradley confirmed. Rifles, shotguns, ammunition, body armor. Whatever you need. Sarah felt a familiar clarity settling over her mind as she shifted from defensive to offensive thinking. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she was truly in her element. All right, she said. Let's get to work. We've got about 10 hours to turn this town into the last place the Kozlov brothers will ever see. The transformation of Millbrook began immediately. Within an hour of the federal agent's revelation, Sheriff Bradley had implemented an emergency evacuation plan that sent most of the town's population to neighboring counties. Families with children were the first to leave, followed by elderly residents and anyone else who couldn't or wouldn't participate in the defense of the town. Sarah stood in the middle of Main Street, surveying the area with the tactical eye of someone who had defended forward operating bases in hostile territory. The town's layout actually offered several advantages for a defensive stand. Main Street was long and straight, providing excellent sightlines for defensive fire. The buildings were mostly brick and stone construction from the early 1900s, offering solid cover. Most importantly, there were multiple escape routes leading out of town if things went badly. Talk to me about numbers, Sarah said to Sheriff Bradley as they walked the perimeter of the town center. Who's staying and what kind of experience do they have? Bradley consulted his notebook. Besides you, me, and the boys from the garage, we've got Deputy Martinez, no relation to you, I assume, who's former Marine Corps infantry. There's old Pete Sullivan who was in Vietnam, though he's pushing 70. 3 volunteer firefighters who know their way around emergency situations. And about a dozen other townspeople who insist on staying to protect their businesses and homes. Any of them have combat experience besides the deputy and Sullivan? Sarah asked. Jim Crawford did 2 tours in Iraq as a truck driver. Maria Santos was Army logistics in Afghanistan. The rest are hunters and sport shooters, but no real military training. Sarah nodded, mentally calculating their defensive capabilities. 20 people total, with maybe half having some relevant experience. Not great odds against 6 professional killers, but we'll make it work. The next several hours were a blur of activity as the town transformed into a defensive position. Carlos and the other mechanics worked around the clock to weld metal barriers and create firing positions. The volunteer firefighters used their trucks to move concrete barriers from the highway construction project into strategic positions around Main Street. Sarah coordinated every aspect of the defense, drawing on years of experience in establishing perimeters in hostile territory. She positioned the most experienced fighters in key overwatch positions where they could provide covering fire for the less experienced defenders. She created multiple fallback positions so that if one line was overrun, the defenders could retreat to prepared positions rather than being caught in the open. Deputy Martinez proved to be exactly the kind of professional Sarah needed. At 35, he had served 3 tours in Fallujah before returning to civilian life and joining the sheriff's department. He understood tactics, could follow orders under fire, and had the combat experience to stay calm in a firefight. "I want you on the roof of the bank building," Sarah told him as they reviewed the defensive positions. "It's the tallest structure with the best sight lines down Main Street. You'll have the best view of their approach, and you can provide sniper support for the street-level positions." "What about you?" Deputy Martinez asked. "Where will you be positioned?" "Mobile," Sarah replied. "I'll move between positions as needed, plugging holes and responding to wherever they concentrate their attack." As evening approached, Sarah gathered the defenders in Murphy's diner for a final briefing. The atmosphere was tense but determined. These were people who had spent their lives in Millbrook, and they weren't about to let foreign killers terrorize their home without a fight. "Listen up," Sarah said, standing at the front of the room. "What we're about to face is unlike anything most of you have experienced. These aren't angry drunks or local troublemakers. They're professional soldiers who have killed people for money. They're well-trained, well-equipped, and they won't hesitate to use any tactics necessary to complete their mission." She paused, looking around the room at faces that ranged from determined to terrified. "But we have advantages they don't. We know this town better than they do. We've had time to prepare defensive positions. And, most importantly, they're coming here expecting to face one target, not an entire town ready to fight back." Old Pete Sullivan raised his hand. "What's their most likely approach?" "They'll probably try to come in fast and loud," Sarah replied. "Their standard operating procedure is to overwhelm resistance with superior firepower and aggressive tactics. They're not used to extended gun battles or siege situations. Their whole strategy is built around quick strikes and rapid extraction. So we make them fight the kind of battle they're not prepared for," said Maria Santos, the former Army logistics specialist. "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "We force them into a prolonged engagement where our knowledge of the terrain and our defensive preparations can neutralize their training advantages." As the briefing concluded, people began moving to their assigned positions. Sarah conducted a final inspection of the defensive perimeter, checking fields of fire, communication systems, and ammunition supplies. Everything was as ready as it could be given their limited time and resources. Around midnight, Deputy Martinez's voice crackled over the radio. "Contact. 2 vehicles approaching from the north. Moving slowly, probably conducting reconnaissance." Sarah keyed her radio. "All positions, this is command. Lights out. No one fires unless I give the order. Let them look around and think we're an easy target." The town of Millbrook went dark as every light was extinguished on command. From her position behind a concrete barrier in front of the hardware store, Sarah could see the 2 vehicles creeping down Main Street with their headlights off, using night vision equipment to survey the area. The vehicles stopped about 200 yards from the town center. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see figures dismounting and spreading out to establish overwatch positions. They were being professional and cautious, which was both good and bad news. Good because it meant they weren't underestimating their opposition. Bad because it meant they wouldn't make the kind of mistakes that overconfident attackers often made. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The attackers were taking their time, gathering intelligence and planning their assault. Sarah used the time to make final adjustments to her defenders' positions and to study the enemy's deployment through her night vision scope. She counted 6 figures total, spread out in a classic assault formation. 2 snipers had taken positions on elevated ground outside the town, while 4 assault specialists were preparing to advance along multiple routes into the town center. Their equipment was top-notch: night vision, suppressed weapons, body armor, and tactical communications gear.
"All positions, this is command," Sarah whispered into her radio.
"They're moving into assault positions. Remember, wait for my signal before engaging. We want them committed to their attack before we reveal our defensive positions." The attack began at exactly 12:47 a.m. with suppressed rifle fire aimed at the windows of buildings where the attackers thought defenders might be positioned. It was a sound tactical approach: use sniper fire to pin down defenders while assault teams move through the streets. What the attackers didn't expect was that Sarah had positioned her people well back from windows and doors, in interior positions that provided protection while still allowing return fire. The initial sniper shots shattered glass and punched holes in walls, but hit no defenders.
"Now," Sarah transmitted. "Light them up."
The peaceful night exploded into chaos as 20 defenders opened fire simultaneously from carefully prepared positions. Muzzle flashes lit up Main Street like a deadly fireworks display, and the sound of gunfire echoed off the brick and stone buildings. The attackers had been caught completely off guard by the volume and coordination of the defensive fire. Instead of facing one person hiding in a building, they found themselves under fire from multiple directions by people who clearly knew what they were doing. One of the assault team members went down immediately, caught in the crossfire between the hardware store position and the bank building. Another was forced to take cover behind a parked car when Deputy Martinez's precise shooting from the bank roof made it impossible for him to advance further up Main Street.
"This is Kozlov, team leader," Sarah heard over her captured radio frequency. "We have heavy resistance. Multiple shooters in prepared positions. Requesting immediate extraction."
But the attackers' problems were just beginning. As they tried to withdraw to their vehicles, they discovered that Sarah had positioned defenders along their planned escape routes. Carlos and Mike had taken positions behind the auto shop with a clear field of fire toward where the vehicles were parked. When the attackers tried to reach their transportation, they came under withering fire from unexpected angles. The battle raged for 30 minutes before the attackers made a critical mistake. Frustrated by their inability to advance or retreat safely, the team leader ordered his remaining men to concentrate their fire on the bank building where Deputy Martinez was positioned. It was sound tactical thinking: eliminate the elevated firing position, but it required them to expose themselves to fire from the street-level defenders. Sarah saw the opportunity immediately. As the attackers focused their attention on the bank building, she broke cover and began moving along Main Street, using the concrete barriers and abandoned vehicles for concealment. Her target was the team leader, whose radio communications she had been monitoring. She found him behind an overturned newspaper stand, trying to coordinate his scattered team while under fire from 3 different directions. He never saw Sarah coming until she was within 15 feet, close enough that her military training took over completely. The engagement lasted less than 10 seconds. The team leader was down and Sarah had his radio and weapon. More importantly, she now had a clear picture of where the remaining attackers were positioned and what their capabilities were. "This is command to all positions," she transmitted. "I have eyes on all remaining hostiles. 4 targets remaining. 2 are wounded and attempting to move east toward the church. 1 is pinned down behind the post office. 1 is in the alley behind the diner." What followed was a methodical elimination of the remaining threats. Working with her defenders, Sarah coordinated a careful advance that closed off escape routes while maintaining overwhelming firepower advantages. The attackers, trained for quick strikes and rapid extractions, found themselves trapped in an urban warfare scenario they weren't prepared for. By 2:30 a.m., the battle was over. 3 attackers were dead, including the team leader. 2 were wounded and in custody. 1 had managed to escape on foot into the countryside, though Sheriff Bradley had already called for assistance from neighboring counties to track him down. The cost to the defenders had been remarkably light. Pete Sullivan had taken a bullet in the shoulder but was stable and talking. 2 other defenders had minor wounds from flying glass and debris. The town itself had suffered significant damage: broken windows, bullet holes in buildings, and destroyed vehicles, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. As dawn broke over Millbrook, Sarah stood in the middle of Main Street surveying the aftermath of the battle. Federal agents were already arriving to take custody of the prisoners and secure the scene. News crews would follow soon, drawn by reports of a gun battle between Russian assassins and small-town Americans.
Agent Chen approached Sarah as she helped load Pete Sullivan into an ambulance. "That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen," he said. "You turned a quiet town into a war zone."
"I turned a quiet town into a fortress," Sarah replied.
"And it worked. The Kozlov brothers just lost their best team and 2 high-value prisoners. They'll think twice before trying this again." "Maybe," Chen conceded. "But you can't stay here now. This location is completely blown, and there will be media attention that makes witness protection impossible." Sarah looked around at the people who had risked their lives to protect her. Carlos was helping clean up debris from the garage. Sheriff Bradley was coordinating with federal agents while Deputy Martinez supervised the crime scene. Even Mike and Johnny, who had barely tolerated her presence just days ago, had fought bravely through the night. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally. "These people stood up for me when they didn't even know who I really was. I'm not going to abandon them now." Agent Chen sighed. "The Kozlovs won't give up. They'll send more people." "Let them come," Sarah said. "Now the whole town knows what they're dealing with. And, next time, we'll be ready for them."
As the morning sun climbed higher over Millbrook, Sarah Martinez, Staff Sergeant Sarah Elena Martinez, finally, felt like she had found where she belonged. 6 months later, Millbrook, Texas, was no longer the quiet, forgotten town it had once been. The story of how a decorated special operations veteran and a group of ordinary citizens had defeated a team of international assassins had spread far beyond the local news. Documentary crews had visited. A major Hollywood studio had purchased the film rights. Tourism had increased dramatically as people came to see the famous Main Street where the Battle of Millbrook had taken place. But, for Sarah Martinez, now openly acknowledged as the town's resident hero and unofficial security consultant, the most important changes were the personal ones. The same people who had once told her to go home, sweetheart, now sought her advice on everything from home security to self-defense training. She had become not just accepted, but genuinely valued as a member of the community. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, there had been investigations, interviews, and endless paperwork. Federal agents had spent weeks in Millbrook, documenting the events and ensuring that all security threats had been neutralized. The surviving members of the Kozlov assassination team had provided valuable intelligence that led to arrests across 3 countries. Sarah had officially declined to re-enter witness protection, instead accepting an offer from Agent Chen to work as a consultant for the Department of Defense's Special Operations training programs. It was work she could do remotely while maintaining her residence in Millbrook, allowing her to finally have the normal life she had sought while still using her skills in service of her country. Thompson's Auto Repair had undergone its own transformation. Bill Thompson had promoted Sarah to shop foreman, a position that acknowledged what everyone already knew: she was the most skilled mechanic in the garage. The business had thrived as word spread about the quality of their work, and Bill had hired 3 additional mechanics to handle the increased demand. Mike and Johnny had both apologized for their earlier treatment of Sarah, sheepishly admitting that they had been intimidated by her competence even before they knew about her military background. Mike had asked Sarah to train him in basic self-defense techniques after witnessing her skills during the battle. Johnny had become something of an unofficial publicist for the garage, eagerly telling customers about how their foreman was a decorated war hero. Carlos had become Sarah's closest friend and confidant in town. As the only other person in the garage with genuine mechanical expertise, he understood and appreciated her skills in a way that went beyond her military reputation. They worked together seamlessly, often communicating through gestures and shared glances that left the other mechanics wondering how they managed to coordinate so effortlessly. The relationship between Sarah and Sheriff Bradley had evolved into a professional partnership that benefited the entire community. Bradley had convinced the town council to create a new position of Emergency Preparedness Coordinator, which Sarah filled on a part-time basis. She conducted training sessions for local law enforcement, organized emergency response drills, and helped develop security protocols for the town's growing tourist industry. Deputy Martinez had become Sarah's second-in-command for all security-related matters. The two military veterans shared an understanding of tactics and procedures that made them an effective team. Under Sarah's guidance, the sheriff's department had transformed from a small-town police force into a professional law enforcement agency that served as a model for other rural communities. The physical scars of the battle had been repaired, but the town had chosen to preserve some evidence of that night. A small memorial in the town square honored the courage of everyone who had participated in the defense of Millbrook.
Bullet holes in the bank building had been preserved behind plexiglass, and a bronze plaque commemorated Deputy Martinez's heroic actions from the rooftop.
Pete Sullivan had recovered fully from his shoulder wound and had become something of a local celebrity, regaling visitors with detailed accounts of the battle. At 71, he was probably the oldest person in American history to engage in combat with foreign assassins, a distinction he wore with considerable pride. The story had attracted attention from military historians and tactical analysts who were fascinated by the successful defense mounted by civilians with minimal training.
Sarah found herself frequently interviewed by researchers studying the lessons learned from the incident.
The battle had become a case study in asymmetric warfare and community defense that was taught in military academies and police training programs. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Sarah saw herself and her place in the world. For 8 years, she had been defined entirely by her military service, her missions, her loyalty to country and unit. The transition to civilian life had left her feeling lost and purposeless, uncertain of her value outside the context of special operations. The events in Millbrook had shown her that her skills and experience had value beyond military applications. She could protect and serve her community in ways that were just as important as anything she had done in Afghanistan or Iraq. More importantly, she had discovered that she could trust others to stand with her when it mattered most. The relationship with her community had also evolved in unexpected ways. Sarah had begun teaching self-defense classes at the local community center, sharing basic protective skills with women and teenagers who wanted to feel safer in their daily lives. These classes had become popular throughout the region, with people driving from neighboring towns to learn from the famous veteran. She had also started a youth mentorship program, working with teenagers who were considering military service or law enforcement careers. Drawing on her own experience of leaving a small town for military service, she helped young people understand both the opportunities and challenges of those career paths. The program had expanded to include college preparation assistance and job training, as Sarah recognized that not every young person was suited for military service but all deserved the chance to reach their potential. The program was funded through donations from tourists and visitors who wanted to contribute to the community that had captured national attention. One of Sarah's greatest personal satisfactions came from her work with Maria Santos, the former Army logistics specialist who had fought in the battle. Maria had struggled with adjustment issues after her military service, feeling isolated and undervalued in civilian employment. Working with Sarah to develop the town's emergency preparedness plans had given Maria a renewed sense of purpose and professional identity. Together, they had created a model for how communities could integrate veterans' skills and experience into civilian emergency services. Their work had been recognized by the Department of Veterans Affairs as an innovative approach to veteran integration, and they had been invited to consult with other communities facing similar challenges. The economic impact of the town's new fame had been substantial but carefully managed. The town council, with Sarah's input, had developed tourism guidelines that preserved Millbrook's small-town character while accommodating visitors interested in the historical significance of the battle. Local businesses had thrived, but the community had avoided the commercialization that sometimes overwhelmed places that experienced sudden fame. Sarah's apartment above the pharmacy had been replaced by a small house on the edge of town, purchased with savings from her consulting work and a loan from the local bank that was eager to help their most famous resident establish permanent roots. The house came with a garage where Sarah worked on her own projects, including the restoration of a 1967 Mustang that had become her passion outside of work hours. The personal relationships that had developed were perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Sarah's new life. She had found romance with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a physician who had moved to Millbrook to serve as the town's first full-time doctor since the previous physician retired 5 years earlier. Jennifer had arrived 3 months after the battle, drawn by the community's story and the opportunity to serve a place that clearly valued dedication and courage. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to serving their community. Jennifer's medical expertise complemented Sarah's security knowledge, and, together they had developed comprehensive emergency medical protocols that were being studied by other rural communities. The couple had become fixtures at community events, with Sarah providing security consultation and Jennifer offering medical services. They were planning to marry in the spring, in a ceremony that would likely draw visitors from around the country who wanted to celebrate the union of two people who had found love through service to others. The broader implications of Sarah's story continued to resonate throughout the military and veteran communities. Her successful transition from elite special operations soldier to valued community member had challenged assumptions about how difficult that adjustment had to be. Military transition programs had begun incorporating lessons learned from her experience, particularly the importance of finding ways for veterans to continue serving their communities. Sarah had testified before Congress about veteran transition issues, drawing on her own experience and the insights gained from working with other veterans in Millbrook. Her recommendations had influenced policy changes that provided better support for veterans seeking to use their military skills in civilian careers. The consulting work with the Department of Defense had evolved into a broader role advising on special operations training and community integration programs. Sarah traveled occasionally to military bases around the country, sharing lessons learned from her experiences and helping to develop more effective approaches to preparing special operations soldiers for eventual civilian transitions. But, regardless of how far her influence spread, Sarah's heart remained in Millbrook. The town that had once made her feel unwelcome had become the home she had never thought possible. The people who had once dismissed her as an outsider had become family in the truest sense of the word. As she stood in Thompson's garage on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, working on the engine of a customer's pickup truck while Carlos organized inventory and Mike swept the floor, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed. The same hands that had once handled classified weapons and explosives were now rebuilding carburetors and changing oil filters. The same tactical mind that had planned dangerous missions behind enemy lines was now focused on improving the efficiency of an auto repair shop in small-town Texas. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't a rejection of her military past so much as an evolution of it. She was still protecting people, still serving something larger than herself, still using her skills and experience to make a positive difference in the world. The scale was different, the methods were different, but the core purpose remained the same. When young people asked her about her transition from military to civilian life, Sarah always told them the same thing: find a place where your skills matter, where people value what you can contribute, and where you can make a difference. It might not be the place you expect, but when you find it, you'll know. She had found her place in Millbrook, Texas, population 1,247, where a decorated special operations veteran had discovered that the most important battles were often fought not on distant battlefields, but in defense of the communities and people you chose to call home. The sign at the edge of town had been updated after the events of that dramatic night 6 months earlier. It still read "Welcome to Millbrook, Texas," but now included an additional line, "Home of Heroes." It was a simple addition that captured the essential truth about what the town had become: a place where ordinary people had done extraordinary things, and where a soldier had finally found the peace she had been searching for. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Thompson's garage, Sarah Martinez, Staff Sergeant Sarah Elena Martinez, hero of Millbrook, smiled as she worked, finally, home.